Hi, everybody. Today we're going to be talking about making inferences easy. Inferences sounds like a really fancy word, but the truth is we make inferences all the time. We make inferences while we read books, we make inferences when we watch movies, and we also make inferences in our daily life. But what we're going to focus on today is how to make inferences when you're reading. So there's a really simple formula that we use to make inferences, and it's on the screen. What I read plus what I know equals the inference. So when we're talking about what you read, we're talking about taking direct quotes and paraphrases from the reading and then using your background knowledge and your own experience to ultimately draw an educated conclusion. So let's get started with practicing. We're going to review two scenarios together. Here are the directions. Read each passage and then respond to the questions. Each question will ask you to make a logical inference based on textual details. Explain your answer by referencing the text. That sounds really fancy, but I'm going to show you what you need to do to be able to answer this. Every day after work, Paul took his muddy boots off on the steps of the front porch. Alice would have a fit if the boots made it so far as the welcome mat. He then took off his dusty overalls and threw them into a plastic garbage bag. Alice left a new garbage bag tied to the porch railing for him every morning. On his way in the house, he dropped the garbage bag off at the washing machine and went straight upstairs to the shower as he was instructed. He would eat dinner with her after he was, quote, presentable, as Alice had often said. And the question we're going to be answering is, what type of work does Paul do? From the reading, they don't explicitly say what Paul does, but we can make an inference or an educated guess as to what he does by following the formula. So we're going to think about what we read, and one quote that stood out to me was, after work, Paul took off his muddy boots. Another quote that stood out to me that might hint at what he does is, he then took off his dusty overalls. What do we know? Farmers, construction workers, and people who work outside might come home dusty with mud on their boots. So I'm going to use what the quotes that I read that really stood out to me and what I know, my background information, to create an inference. The inference that I came up with is, Paul probably does outdoor labor work because, now we're going to use what we know, he comes home dusty and muddy and wears overalls and boots. That is my inference. Let's move on to the next scenario. Same directions, we're going to read the passage and respond to the question. Each question will ask us to make a logical inference. So we're making an inference again, but we have to reference the text. Valerie opened up the letter from the military department. She felt the pit of her stomach drop to the bottom of the earth before she even opened it. She knew it was news about John. As she read the first line, she thought of all the lunches she had packed him and all the nights she tucked him in his bed and warded off the nighttime monsters. The man carrying the flag put his hand on her shoulder. She thought of the day that John signed up for the military. Her tears wet the letter. She stopped reading after the first line. What is Valerie's relationship to John? So they don't tell us about their relationship explicitly in this text, but we can make an educated guess as to who Valerie was to John. Here is a line that really stood out to me. She thought of all the lunches she packed him and all the nights she tucked him in his bed. What do we know? Well, I know that parents usually tuck their children into bed. And if Valerie's tucking in John into bed, Valerie is probably John's mother. So my my inference that I'm coming up with is, Valerie's probably John's mother because, and I need to reference the text, because parents are usually the people who tuck their children into bed, and she tucked John into bed. So that is my inference. Let's try another question for the same passage. What does the letter probably say? What we read from the text that really stood out to me is the quote, the letter from the military department. So we know that that letter came from the military. And then the second quote, the pit of her stomach dropped to the bottom of the earth. And then there's one more quote. There's one more quote that says the man carrying the flag. And what do we know? So what I know, because I have family in the military, so if you have this background information too, this would be helpful. When someone in the military dies, they usually deliver a message to the family and give them a flag. I've also seen this in movies. So if you have the same background information that I do, you probably will come up with the same educated guess, which is that the letter probably says that John has died in the military because the mom's stomach dropped to the bottom of the earth. It came from the military department, and the man is handing the mom, who we think is the mom, the flag. All right, so now it's your turn. You're going to complete practice activities to measure your understanding, but I will be helping you in this round. So let's look at our very first task card. Asteroids are large objects in our solar system that orbit the sun. They are made from rock and metal. Some are so large they have moons just like planets do. Meteoroids are like asteroids, but they are smaller. A meteoroid can be as small as a pebble or even a grain of sand. Do meteoroids orbit the sun? How do you know? So I need to figure out, do meteoroids orbit the sun? And we're going to use the same formula. What we read, we're going to pull textual evidence that's important, and what we know. And then you're going to answer it. So I would like you to think about, before we move on, what quotes stand out to you? And what background information do you already have that will help you answer this question? And you can pause to think. All right, here's what I got. So, what we read, two quotes really stand out to me. Asteroids are large objects that orbit the sun. So, we know that asteroids orbit the sun. And then the second quote, meteoroids are like asteroids but smaller. So, let's look at what we know. If asteroids are just like meteoroids, then they must do the same thing too, but just smaller. So, my inference is that meteoroids probably do orbit the sun because they are similar to asteroids, but they are smaller. Here's our next practice. We're going to look at the question to help us when we're hunting for our textual evidence. So the question says, how is malaria transmitted? How do you know? Now let's read the passage and try to figure that out. Over 600,000 people die of malaria each year. Most of those people live in sub-Saharan Africa, and most of them are children under 5 years old. When people in malaria-stricken countries sleep under insecticide-treated mosquito nets, they are much less likely to get malaria. Unfortunately, only about 5% of children in sub-Saharan Africa sleep under insecticide-treated nets. So the question again is, how is malaria transmitted and how do we know? So we're going to think about what we read and pull out important quotes from there. And then we're also going to think about what background information do we already know to create our inference, our educated guess. I'm going to let you pause right here and think about what your answers might be. And now let's check them. So here's a quote that really stood out to me. When people in malaria-stricken countries sleep under insecticide-treated mosquito nets, they are much less likely to get malaria. So let's think about what we know now. Mosquitoes carry malaria. So if I put both of these two things together, I come up with the inference that malaria has to be transmitted by mosquitoes who have malaria and they are biting people. Because unless people are sleeping under those nets, they're going to get bitten and have a high chance of getting malaria. So how is malaria transmitted? Definitely transmitted by mosquito bites. All right, let's try our third. So in 1848, in 1848, gold was discovered in a river near San Francisco. News of the find spread across the United States and even to other countries. Soon, thousands of people were coming to California with dreams of finding enough gold to make themselves rich. By 1855, the California gold rush was over. How long did the gold rush last? How do we know? And when we come across these prompts that have a reading and questions, we always really want to pay attention to that question because it gives us a clue as to what we should be hunting for when it comes to textual evidence. And we're specifically looking at how long did the gold rush last. Two quotes stand out to me here. In 1848, gold was discovered, and by 1855, the California gold rush was over. What we know. So we know the start and end years of the gold rush, so we can subtract them. By subtracting these two dates, I can infer that the gold rush lasted 7 years. So I infer that the gold rush lasted 7 years. All right. So are you looking for more practice? I highly suggest that you do more practice, and I'm going to give you guys time to do this. You're going to test your knowledge and then check your answers. I'm going to show you the prompts. You're going to answer them, and then you can check your answers at the very end. So here is our first slide. Do monkeys in Ethiopia hang from trees by their tails? How do you know? There are 150 species of monkeys. New World monkeys like spider monkeys, tamarins, and capuchins live in the Americas. So, excuse that double in. Live in the Americas. They often have prehensile tails that they can use to grip branches. Old World monkeys like baboons, macaques, and colobus monkeys live in Africa and Asia. Old World monkeys do not have prehensile tails. So now you're going to answer this for yourself. I highly suggest, and I think it's a really good idea, for you guys to Google prehensile tails so you know what that means. This is a good vocab word for you to learn. All right, let's look at number 5. Would the Great Salt Lake be a good place to go fishing? Why or why not? I'm going to read you the prompt. The Great Salt Lake in Utah is even saltier than the ocean. The salt comes from minerals in the rivers and streams that feed into the lake. The lake has no outlet, so the salt continues to collect. Because it is so salty, only brine shrimp, brine flies, and algae can live there. However, many birds come to the lake to feast on these animals. Let's look at our answers for 4 and 5. So for number 4, you should have came up with monkeys in Ethiopia do not hang by their tails because they do not have prehensile tails. According to the text, Old World monkeys do not have prehensile tails. It also says that Old World monkeys live in Africa. Ethiopia is in Africa, so no swinging monkeys there. Number 5, the Great Salt Lake would not be a good place to go fishing because there are no fish there. The text states that fish cannot live in the water there because it is too salty. Let's do 2 more. What did Armstrong mean by one giant leap for mankind? What makes you think so? The first time a human walked on the moon was on July 20th, 1969. After a journey from Earth of 4 days, astronaut Neil Armstrong climbed out of the lunar module. As he stepped onto the surface of the moon, Armstrong said these famous words. That's one step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Take a minute to pause and answer this on your own. All right, number 7. Why didn't President Washington live in the White House? What makes you think so? Construction on the White House began in 1793. It was ready for its first resident in 1800. President Washington oversaw the construction, but he never lived there. The first president to live in the White House was John Adams, who became president in 1797. Since then, every U.S. president has lived in the White House. Let's go over the answers. Armstrong meant that even though he was only taking a regular step, it was a giant leap for mankind because it was a huge accomplishment to actually land humans on the moon. And number 7, President Washington did not live in the White House because by the time it was completed in 1800, he was no longer president. The text says that John Adams became the president in 1797. And here's our last practice. Why does, so ignore this double does, why does the scout ant leave a trail of pheromones? What makes you think so? Ants communicate using special scents called pheromones. For example, a scout ant will leave the nest to find food. When she finds something good to eat, she will eat a small amount and then go straight back to the nest. She will leave a trail of pheromones along the way. You can pause and answer the question. Here is the answer. The scout ant leaves a trail of pheromones to tell the other ants in her nest where there is food. The text says she leaves a trail for other ants to follow. I hope that all of you found this helpful, and I will be posting more practice for you to be able to do